Why, hello there and welcome back to our series of videos on the heart. So in our last video, we looked at how we can describe the flow of blood through the heart. And remember how we began with deoxygenated blood returning to the right atrium, and then we followed the sequence of events down and the sequence of events down here until we saw how blood was pumped out from the left ventricle to the aorta. And after that, we also discovered that even though we described this sequence of events in a sort of a straight sequence from step 1 all the way down to step 10, however, we realized that several events actually take place together. So we saw, for example, how both atria contract together at the same time in what is called atrial systole. And then we saw how both ventricles contract together in what is called the ventricular systole. And then we saw how both ventricles then relax together. Right? So this is called diastole, as we shall see. So in the rest of this video, we're going to talk about this cycle of events called the cardiac cycle. Right? It's going to be a hard-going video, but try to just focus and try to understand it. We can ask many questions and clarify in class, but let's try to focus and follow and learn about what this cardiac cycle is all about. So what is the cardiac cycle? Well, simply put, it is the sequence of events that take place in one heartbeat. Okay, the key idea is that it actually happens in one heartbeat. So there's some scientific doctor speak medical terms I need to introduce at this point. And that's this, the systole, or some people say systole. The systole means contraction, and diastole means relaxation. Right? Some people remember it as die, right? Or die already. So relax. So diastole is relaxation, systole is contraction. So our cardiac cycle begins with the atrial systole. So the atria, both atria, will contract together, causing blood to move from the atria into the ventricles. Right? Now in the second phase, both ventricles will contract in what is called the ventricular systole. So both ventricles will contract together. Right? The right ventricle contracts and blood is pumped out through the pulmonary artery. The left ventricle contracts and blood is pumped out through the aorta. So both ventricles contract together, and the atria at this point already start to relax and blood starts to flow back into them. So it's the second phase. The third phase is called the atrial diastole and ventricular diastole. So the whole heart is now in a relaxed state and blood can fill the heart. So blood will flow into the right and left atria and then flow into the right and left ventricles as well. And then the cycle repeats itself. Atrial systole, ventricular systole, atrial diastole, and ventricular diastole. Alright, and the cycle repeats itself. In class, we're going to do a cool thing with our hands to show how this works. Alright, so at this point, I would like you to read your textbook on page 163, read it through, and I want you to think about and write down what happens during each stage. For example, atrial systole, both atria will contract, right? And then blood moves from the atria to the ventricles, right? Something like that. And do that for the rest of the rows as well. Please do this, it will really, really help you, and you need to be very clear what is happening. Now, I hope you've read your textbook and tried to understand the cardiac cycle well, because this next part is going to be difficult, but it is not too difficult for you guys. And I want you to persevere and have resilience and try to understand it. So you see a graph over here. It's a graph that shows pressure on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. So this is actually showing how pressure changes over time during one cardiac cycle. Alright, so one cardiac cycle, as in one cycle like this, usually takes about 0.8 seconds, usually, or less than that. So what are the changes in pressure during one cardiac cycle? in the left side of the heart. Now, in the left side of the heart, we have three important structures, and we are going to look at the pressure changes in each of those structures. So the first one, this reddish line here at the bottom, this shows the pressure changes in the left atrium during one cardiac cycle. The black line shows you the pressure changes in the left ventricle during one cardiac cycle. And the yellow line shows you the pressure changes in the aorta during one cardiac cycle. Right? From 0 seconds to 0.8 seconds, how does the pressure change in the left atrium, in the left ventricle, and in the aorta? Now you will realize that I divided this graph into three parts based on the cardiac cycle. The first part here in blue, this is during atrial systole. Right? The second part here in green is our ventricular systole. And finally, the last part in red, this is the diastole of both the atria and the ventricles. So now we're going to take a look at this in greater detail in each section, and I need you to try to pick up what are the key events, what are the key explanations for each section. Now let's start with the atrial systole, which is the blue region of the graph here. Now before looking at the graph, let's just think about what we already know about atrial systole. So what happens in the chambers? Well, during atrial systole, the left atrium contracts. Right? So you can see that in the diagram here, the left atrium contracts. How does blood flow? Well, when the left atrium contracts, blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Right? Now, in order for that to happen, what happens to the valves? Well, we know that this valve here, the bicuspid valve, which is an atrial ventricular valve, will open up. So this bicuspid valve will open to allow blood to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Now, what pressure changes happen during this event? Well, because the left atrium contracts, the pressure inside the left atrium will increase slightly. So if you look at the graph here, this red line shows the left atrium's pressure. So you can see that at this point, the pressure starts to increase slightly because the left atrium contracts. Now you also notice that the pressure in the left ventricle, the black line, the pressure in the left ventricle also increases together with the pressure in the left atrium. And that's because the left ventricle starts to fill up with blood. So as blood flows into the left ventricle, its pressure starts to increase. It's just like if you pour water fill a balloon up with water, the pressure inside the balloon will start to increase. So as the left ventricle gets filled up with blood, its pressure will also start to increase slightly. Now importantly, you can see that the left atrium pressure is higher a bit. It's a little higher than the left ventricle pressure. And that is what causes the bicuspid valve to open, because the pressure in the left atrium is slightly higher than the pressure in the left ventricle. It causes this valve to open and blood to flow through. Okay, so that's what happens in the atrial systole. Hope you're still surviving. We now move on to the ventricular systole, which is in the green region of the graph here. I have also pointed out 2 points, point A and point B, which are of particular interest or importance. So before we look at the graph, let's just think about what we know about ventricular systole. So ventricular systole, right, it means that the ventricles contract. So in this case, what happens in the chambers? The left ventricle contracts, right? And I've written that starts at point A. So at point A, the left ventricle contracts. And that's why you see the pressure in the left ventricle start to increase, until the pressure in the left ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta. Right, you can see the black line here goes above the yellow line. Now, as long as the pressure in the left ventricle is higher than the pressure in the aorta, then blood will flow from the left ventricle into the aorta. Right? Blood always flows from higher pressure to lower pressure, right? So as long as the left ventricle has a higher pressure than the aorta, blood will flow into the aorta. And so how does blood flow? Blood flows from the left ventricle to the aorta after point B. So what happens to the valves? Well, there's two important points you need to know here. First, let's look at point A. Now at point A, the atrioventricular valve or the bicuspid valve closes. And there is a sound that takes place when the valve closes, which is the lup. You know your heartbeat, lup dup? So the first lup comes from this bicuspid valve closing. So why does it close? It closes because the left ventricle pressure starts to increase. The left ventricle contracts, the pressure starts to increase. And the pressure here in the left ventricle is greater than the pressure in the left atrium. So without the valve, if the valve wasn't there, then blood would flow from the left ventricle back into the left atrium. But because the valve is there, it will close and prevent the blood from moving back into the left atrium. Alright, so from point A onwards, the atrioventricular valve, the bicuspid valve, is closed. Now at point B, remember point B is where the left ventricle pressure becomes higher than the aorta pressure. So because of that, the semilunar valve here in the aorta will open up, right, and allow blood to flow into the aorta. We now move on to the last phase, which is the atrial diastole and ventricular diastole in the orange part of the graph here, with 2 points of importance, point C and point D. Now before looking at the graph again, let's just think about what we know about this phase. So during ventricular diastole, we know that the left ventricle relaxes, right? So the left ventricle here relaxes, and of course the left atrium also relaxes. Now because the left ventricle relaxes, we notice that the pressure in the left ventricle starts to decrease. So you can see even from this point, the pressure in the left ventricle already starts to decrease. And at point C, the pressure in the ventricle becomes lower than the pressure in the aorta, and it decreases further. And at point D, the pressure in the left ventricle actually decreases such that it becomes lower than pressure in the left atrium. So how does blood flow at this point? Well, blood at this point starts to flow into the atria and then into the ventricles. So you take a look at this graph here, you can see that in the left atrium, right, blood pressure already starts to increase a bit at this point. And that's because the atria are being filled up. Now, after point D, when the left ventricle pressure drops below the left atrium, then blood will start to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle because the pressure is high in the left atrium, right? So blood will then flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Alright, so what happens to the valves? Now at point C, the semilunar valves close, and that gives you the dup sound. Okay, so the lup dup, the second sound of the heartbeat, comes from point C when the semilunar valve in the aorta closes. And that's because at point C, the blood pressure in the left ventricle drops below the aorta. So if the semilunar valve doesn't close, then blood will flow back from the aorta into the left ventricle. But because of the valve, even though the pressure in the left ventricle is lower, okay, blood will still keep flowing into the aorta, right, and doesn't flow back into the left ventricle. And at point D, right, when the left ventricle pressure drops below the left atrium pressure, right, so the left atrium pressure becomes higher, right, that's where the bicuspid valve will open again and blood will flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Alright, I know it's a really tough chapter, the very tough part of this topic, but let's try to get our heads around it and I can explain more to you all again in class. So what would be really helpful at this point is for you to take out your textbook and read page 165 for pure bio students, right, and look at what are the pressure changes like in the left side and also in the right side of the heart. Okay, your textbook will show you the right side of the heart as well. How is it similar and how is it different? See whether that helps you, and I'll see you back in class.